Welcome, and for those of you who are unable to join us, thanks for posting your questions. This is Dr. Compost, Peter Howard, our science guy who answers all your fabulous tricky questions. And I've got a few here that I'm going to start running through with him. So if anyone has any more questions at a further date, feel free to send them through and we'll continue to answer questions every fortnight and then post the recording once we've done. So first question we had was from Linda, and she was asking, here it is, I'm just going to pull it up. Love to hear what those of us in the northern part of North America might do to help our worms survive the winter. And apparently there's a really big freeze going over there at the moment. So it's a great question. My sub pod is sunk into the ground, so the worms can crawl into the soil a foot down. But how should we be protecting them from the cold other than a thick layer of leaves in the sub pod? I know we should feed them less often during the cold season, but continue until then, question mark. I live in southwestern PA, zone 5B. Over to you, Peter. Welcome, Wendy, again.
Hi. Yeah, I'll start with just general guidance about worms in the winter. But for this person in zone 5B, basically the thing to keep in mind is the worms are actually going to keep active. I'll give this answer in Fahrenheit, because right now we're getting into winter for North America, and so I might have this conversation again in Celsius when it's relevant for the Celsius countries. But anyway, for the moment, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're talking about soil temperature, not air temperature, is the point at which worms will start to slow down. So you can, as a ballpark, you can think the soil is going to be at least 10 to 20 degrees warmer than the air temperature. And another way to think about it is the day and nighttime temperatures will swing, of course, and so you'll kind of average them to get a ballpark. So you're trying to get a rough guide, but the ideal, of course, is if you have a digital thermometer, you can stick that in the soil, actually ideally in the worm bedding itself, and get an actual reading of the temperature. You might be surprised. It's going to be a reasonable amount warmer than the air temperature because of a couple things. One, because of the insulating of the soil, and two, because you've got respiration going on in the compost, which is generating a bit of heat. So that's all helping the worms in wintertime. But then basic guidance you should consider is insulating the sub pod from the extremes of the air temperature. And so as this person was wanting guidance beyond putting in leaves as mulch, definitely want to make sure that the soil around the sub pod is heavily mulched. And in the wintertime, a good mulch for that is like a straw mulch, which has a lot of loft to it and holds a lot of air, because one of your chief benefits is from still air, basically trapped in proximity to the sub pod. So that's a good choice. Even you could even consider putting a couple handfuls of that inside the worm, the chamber itself with the worms. So above the worm blanket, you could put some straw above there, and that'll also slow down the loss of heat. The other thing to keep in mind is if your sub pod is, and it looked like this person who's asking a question had their sub pod positioned to the open sky, and if you have a cloudless night, you lose quite a bit of heat from trees or plants, or in this case, sub pods that are right under an open sky. So if that's the case, another good idea is to consider putting some kind of insulation on the lid of the sub pod. So an easy recommendation here is like a silvered foil, the standard foam that's got a anodized mylar, which looks like silver, which is bonded to the foam surface. And if you have a couple layers of that and you cut a piece that's about the size of your lid, it won't interfere with using the sub pod, and it'll help you keep air. You'll still get the airflow from the panels around the lid, but it'll also help prevent heat loss from the top. So those are general guidances. And then beyond that, if you're able to track the temperature and watch the worms and see that that's enough, then you can just stay there. Another step that takes you further is to add a cold frame. So this is a plastic or a glass box that sits on top of the garden bed. And it's sort of using the principle of a solarium where the sun's coming in, warming up the air, keeping it still, and giving the worms a bit more heat from the sun when it does happen to shine in the winter. You don't want that obviously completely airtight because you still want air to get in through the edges, but you want to keep winds from blowing. So you have to think about adding it to the bed in a way that doesn't let drafts sort of blow through and lose the benefit of that warmer still air trapped overhead. And then finally, the most high-tech approach, some people are actually buying germination mats for plant seedlings. They're designed as waterproof mats sitting under seed trays for raising the temperature a bit. And we have guidance of how to set those up on the Grow Hub. There's people that have done this already. There's a guy in Washington who's one of the first, I think, who set up a system, but now there's a number of other adopters who have set such things up. And the principle there is you're creating a heat zone at the top, and the worms get to choose how close they want to come to that. Final thing I'll say about this is that watch the worm feeding behavior. So make sure that if it is getting colder, to see if it's taking them longer to get through the same amount of food that they used to get through in shorter time, and adjust how much food you're adding accordingly, so that you want to keep kind of in concert with the worm feeding activity and the amount of food waste you're adding, and that should get them through the winter. But the good news is they will survive all the way down to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. If it gets that cold, they'll just stop feeding and they'll slow down as it goes below 50 toward 30. So you should be able to keep your worms happy, and let us know if you have specific questions, and I can give more specific guidance beyond that.
Great. So I just thought we'd check in with Wendy before I go on to the next question. Wendy, did you have anything you wanted to ask Peter while you're here?
You have to unmute yourself if you do, Wendy, or a comment.
And if you didn't want to, then you're most welcome to.
Oh,
this is.
Hello.
Hello.
So I don't know if I have anything specific, just the general things you talked about, but what do you recommend? Minnesota gets much colder than 30 degrees.
Oh yeah.
Can drop down to like -20 Fahrenheit.
Yes,
So,
well, that's getting serious. And what I'd recommend in those conditions is probably getting a bin and putting it in a warmer place. So do you have a garage that gets a bit warmer, or a place that's sort of not all the way to a place where you wouldn't want to have, say, compost and stuff getting scattered when you stir the food waste? Do you have a place like that?
yeah, I mean, I've considered, taking it out of the ground and bring it into the garage. I just didn't know if is that the best solution?
Well, it's if you're getting that cold, the advantage of doing a version of that, and this as a suggestion, what you could do instead, rather than actually dig up the whole sub pod, which could be a bit of a chore, is just get a big plastic bin and move the contents from the sub pod into that bin over winter, and then move them back when it starts to warm up.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
That's going to be fine. I mean, it's basically you won't have the worm holes, of course, but because you're moving all of the bedding into a largish bin, as long as you have a bit of a cover for the top of it, it'll allow you to keep adding food waste all winter.
So it doesn't need holes. It's just like some kind of tote or plastic bin or something that you can put them in.
Exactly, just a simple, reasonably large plastic bin, and try to buy one that has a fair amount of surface area, so that it's relatively shallow, say maybe a foot deep or so, and about 2 to 3 feet wide. That would be about right. And that allows you to spread the worms and make sure there's plenty of air.
Moving Dr. Compost out of the rain.
We're trying to do this outdoors, and it's a bit drizzly here today, so keeping the laptop from getting shorting out from the rain. Yeah, so how does that sound? Does that sound like a reasonable remedy to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good idea. I'm just still worried our garage isn't insulated. So on the really cold days, like when it drops below 30 or 0 Celsius, I guess.
Yeah.
Should
Do you
I
have,
bring
do you
them
have,
inside? Like,
yeah, do you have an electrical outlet in your garage that you could plug into?
oh yeah.
Okay, so the other thing is if you go online, you can find these things called seed germination mats. And if you bought one of those, especially one that has a thermostat, you can plug that in and put that directly on top of the worm blanket. And that'll just provide a bit of heat. It'll provide gentle heat. They're designed to sort of support a bit of a warmer condition for germinating seeds, but they're waterproof. And so that would be ideal to put inside the bin.
So what temperature? I'm assuming that you can set those seed mats at different temperatures.
Some of them do have a thermostat. So the simpler ones just raise the temperature by 10 or 15 degrees. But the more sophisticated ones, it costs slightly more and I think are worth getting. You can set a temperature. And what I'd recommend is setting it at around, say, 50 or thereabouts. So you're not running a huge power bill, just keep your worms
Yeah.
warm. But it would be enough to support them. And start with that, and then track the worms and see how they're doing. But I think that'll be the most convenient way for you to sort of keep a good temperature, keep feeding the worms. You'll just pull that out as you add the food and then adjust accordingly. I wouldn't go lower than 50, but you could, experiment between 50 and 60
Okay.
Fahrenheit.
All right.
And,
Sounds good.
and let us know how you go with that. We're always interested in getting, customer experience in colder places so we can really provide the best guidance for people in winter that's the least hassle, but it's still effective.
Sure. Yeah, I will.
Okay.
And I'd love to find
Okay.
someone who might use the low-tech version of a hot water bottle.
Yeah.
With a bit of polystyrene around them or something, snuggle them in.
Yes.
But anyway. And
Yeah.
welcome, Linda. Look, that we were just answering your question. So look, while you're here, if you wanted to ask anything more specific of Peter.
Oh, sorry, you'll have to unmute yourself a little bit.
Okay, how's that?
That's
Yay.
good. That's good.
So I'm sorry I missed your answer. I assume that you were talking to someone who also
Yes.
lives in the cold.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a sort of a keen interest right now because of winter approaching in the US. What I was guessing from your picture was that your sub pod might be open to the night sky. Is it in a place where there's not an overhanging shelter above it, or is it?
That's correct. I didn't send a picture, but I don't.
Oh,
but it's
okay.
out
Well,
it is out in an open garden.
yeah,
It's sunk down, into
Yeah.
the soil. And I had kind of hoped that the worms would crawl off into the soil where it's, 56, 57 degrees and hang out for the winter. Is that not a good expectation?
Well,
that they won't do that?
so keep in mind the fact that the compost worms are a bit of a different, they're specialists in food, and so they're different than soil earthworms. And so they tend to not go too deep into the soil. They tend to like to be more at the upper levels of soil. So in nature, they're going to be living at the very top of the soil, just under the leaf litter layer. And so they, in hardship, they can go down, but it's not their preference. But if your soil temperatures are in the 50s, then I would suspect the bedding in the sub pod would be similar. And so they should be fine. But the one other thing I would recommend is cutting a piece of insulation that you can tape to the top of the lid. And that'll reduce the heat loss further. So
But you have there's holes all around the top
it's
that
true.
are showing, right?
true.
Because I didn't sink it down. So
Yeah.
should all of that be covered all the way around?
Well, so you want to have those the tiny holes in the aeration panel should be getting air. So this would just be buying you a little bit of a benefit. But you can go the next step, which is getting a cold frame, which is basically, I don't know if you're familiar with cold frames, but you could get one that would fit to the top of the bed. And then that would give you, really a comfortable sort of remedy where hopefully you could set it up in a way where it wasn't a chore to open and close it to access the worms. I'm not sure the back of your garden bed, whether it's constructed that you could add a hinge to it or you have to lift it off every time. But
Yeah, and we get a good bit of snow. And
okay.
so trudging out in the snow, I was kind of
Yeah.
hoping they would sleep, except most of the, I mean, we have days where it warms up above freezing. But,
Yeah,
but we might go 20 days or more with below
sure.
freezing.
So
So
the other thing I was suggesting to people that have a garage or a space indoors where they could move worms is if you just bought a plastic bin, just a simple bin that's maybe just a foot deep or so, and maybe 2 to 3 feet wide. 2 feet wide is probably 2 feet deep, and about 2.5 feet wide would be about right. And just move the worms and bedding into that bin, and then put a top on it. And the advantage of that is you wouldn't have to trudge out into the snow to add your food waste to the system.
that sounds wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. I recommend that's
Although
going
my husband's not going to be happy that I move worms into the house.
Well, maybe, do you guys have a mudroom or something that you could put it in?
No, the garage is fine. We have an outer
Okay.
garage. It actually does have a electric
Oh, perfect.
heat. We rarely put it on, but it's
Yeah.
possible I could put it on to keep the temperature in there above freezing, above maybe 50. Is that
Above
what you'd
50.
suggest, above 50?
50 is the lower limit. So 55, below 55, they'll start slowing down and eating less. And so the other thing you can do is, rather than heat up the whole garage, which is a bit of a waste of power, is just buy a seed germination mat and then lay that on top of the worm blanket inside. Or actually, so if you've got, because the worm blanket won't cover the bin, but if you had some kind of a cloth covering you could put on the bed, and then just lay the germination mat on top of that, plug it in, and then set a temperature for, say, 55. Then the worms will stay just as active as they would be outdoors. They'll get through as much food.
That would have to be running all the time then, I suppose.
Well, it would only, if you buy one that has a thermostat, then they're designed to use very little power, because basically it's a plastic mat that's waterproof, and so it's putting out a very low level of heat. And so I think the cost would be, a few pennies. Typically, I don't know what your kilowatt hour costs are, but it would be using very, very small, very low wattage.
And then you would feed them once a week, turning things
You could,
over?
you could feed them the normal amount. So if you're feeding them twice a week, you could still do that, and just keep an eye on their activity. So if you notice they're taking a bit longer to get through food, you could choose either to turn up the heat on the mat, or just feed them a bit less. You can kind of assess what works best for you.
Okay, all right. It'll be a project getting them out of the bin.
Oh, well, here's my recommendation is, do you have an aerator?
Yeah, the one that
Okay,
came with the kit.
Yeah. So typically, if you have a bucket, you can
Yeah.
just basically transfer one aerator scoop at a time, and you'll be able to get the bulk of them out that way. And then you can just get a bit of use your hands to get into the corners, something like that. I wouldn't use a trowel, because you'll probably cut up a few worms scraping with the edge of the trowel to the wall of the bin. But you'll be surprised. You can actually get quite a bit of it out with the aerator that way.
I have a cat trying to scratch things behind.
Oh.
So while we're on this
my.
winter subject, we've got customers who are looking for specific temperature for ranges for when to start their sub pod, and the temperature cutoff when starting the sub pod is not advised.
Yeah, I kind of addressed that. So basically, if you're starting from, not having had a system at all, you're trying to grow the population up. And so if you only have a couple thousand worms that you're buying through the mail, probably starting in winter isn't the easiest. unless you're really living in a warmer place like California or Florida or Texas, maybe South Carolina would work too, because it's just you're kind of working against yourself. I think it's better to wait till the climate's more favorable if you're in a colder place, because really you want to be around 50 degrees Fahrenheit or higher ideally, for the worms to start taking off, and their sweet spot is around 65 to about 75. So that's why fall and spring are really ideal times to get your worms going. And then you can do a few tricks to get them through a hot summer and a cold winter.
Once they're established, they get much more robust.
Yeah, once you establish them, and there's a lot of bedding, they have the buffer of all that bedding. And also they'll have eggs that they lay that can wait until conditions are optimal to hatch. But if you're starting out with just a few, my analogy is like you've got a fire starting from a glowing ember. You know, you have to pay a lot more attention until the fire is blazing, and then you can be more relaxed about it. Similar with the worms. Once the population is up, they'll manage really well. They'll adjust their numbers according to the food you provide.
And then that goes on to restarting your sub pod again after it's been, either harvested or maybe after winter.
Mhm.
Do you need to add the coir peat or bedding material again after you've harvested or after you?
Yeah, so there was a question, someone who was thinking that they needed to add coir after harvesting compost, and they were concerned their local supplier didn't have coir available, and I said that was just fine. So the bedding itself is already the perfect environment. If they've been generating the worm castings, they'll be happy in that environment. There is a point to be made for making a mixture. So let's say you are harvesting and you do have coir available. If you made a part mixture of the coir and the compost, then you'd be able to use more of that compost in the garden, and the coir would give you a sort of a structure that's beneficial for the bedding. So by structure, I mean the fibers of the coir basically allow more air to get into the bedding, so it keeps the system more aerobic than it would be with just pure castings. What you'll notice with the pure castings, they tend to have a bit of a fudgy texture, and so that's why you're fluffing it up with the aerator all the time. By adding a bit of coir, you're increasing the loft of the bedding, and so it just allows the environment to work more readily in an aerobic fashion.
And then that leads on to how long should it take for the carbon that I've added to in the bin to break down compared to the food waste? That was another question.
Yeah, so the carbon will depend on the form of carbon you're adding. So if you're adding really processed carbon like paper or cardboard, that'll break down relatively quickly. Paper will break down almost the same rate as food scraps. Cardboard will take a bit longer if it's wet. If it's dry, it can take quite a while. And then from there, other forms of carbon are a bit more resistant to breakdown, such as wood shavings or the coconut coir. They'll take quite a bit longer to break down. So there's no reason to favor one over the other than it's making use of what you have on hand is ideal. If you have a good ideally waste material that you can put in that provides the carbon, that's fine. If you had access to rotting leaves, that's one of my favorite carbon sources because it's pre-inoculated with microbes. If they're leaves that have been rotting a bit on the soil surface for a while, gathering those up and using them as your carbon source is a good choice. So the thing I wouldn't recommend are lumps of woody waste, such as roots or twigs, small branches. That's not really suitable for the sub pod. It's more of a worm composting system that prefers softer foods or very fine carbon with lots of surface area. So if you did have the occasional stray avocado pit or seed from a fruit that got in there, it's not a hardship. It's just that it'll take a very long time to break down, and you'll end up with lumps of seeds that are sitting there at the end. You'll just have to fish out when you're harvesting the compost. So keep that in mind.
And then I've got the voles question, which is I have the voles that dig holes. I think they're trying to get to the food when I feed my worms. My concern is this winter their holes will allow the cold air to get to the worms. I'm trying putting used kitty litter in the holes. Any other suggestions?
Yeah, well, it's interesting about them. Of course, the best remedy is using one of those meshes, like a hardware cloth, they call it. You know, galvanized mesh of a fairly fine mesh size. In Australia, they call it mouse mesh or snake mesh. And you know, the thing about that is that usually that's ideal to add when you're setting up the bed. So you would line the bottom of your garden bed with that, so they actually can't gain entry through the bed. And so after the fact, probably the next best thing is putting wire around the sub pod itself. But then, as this person's pointing out, if they're tunneling up to the sub pod, then they'll create a hole that could let in the cold air. So it depends a bit on your garden bed setup. If it's going to be too much of a hassle to add the hardware cloth, you know, after the fact, after you set it up, then you're pretty much stuck with using a mesh wrapping around the walls of the sub pod so they don't end up, you know, chewing their way in. And then hopefully they recognize they can't get access and they stop going there. It's just that if they persist, then you know, if the population is big enough or there's no other food around, then you might have to add something to the top of the bed to further insulate it from cold air going through the holes into the sub pod.
Right. And I see we have Kate just joined us. Welcome, Kate. Sorry, it took a moment for me to see you in the waiting room. But Kate's the one who asked the question about the little, she's from Sydney, and asked the question about the tiny red spiders.
Right. Okay, so those could be mites. Yeah, the one I'm looking at, that it's a bit hard to tell from that image. Yeah.
I'd have to, that's me zoomed in as much as I could, but maybe
so
Kate, if you're there.
yeah, so Kate, okay, great. So do you have a lot of these or just a few so far?
Yeah, it seems to be, they're really hard to see.
Yeah.
But they are massing quite a lot.
Okay.
And
yeah,
know,
the way I would look at that is oftentimes there'll be like an indicator species of what the environment is like in your sub pod. So is it fairly wet in there? They tend to be, if it's red mites, they tend to be attracted to sort of damp conditions. Well, how would you assess what the bedding's like currently?
Yeah, so so we've got a lot of coconut coir in there because it's one of the ones that we just started off. So we've had it for about probably a little bit over 2 weeks, and of course we've had a lot of rain in that time.
Yeah.
So it's in a bag. It's in one of the sub pod grow bags. And I can see a water line on the grow bag.
Yes. So you guys have had a crazy wet year this year. I think it's broken all the records. And so what, 2.1 meters of rain so far, or 2.2 meters of rain. So yeah, so it's very likely that what's happened is enough rain has gone to the soil and some of that has gone through the wormholes and made the bedding a bit extra wet. And so there's a couple of options for you. One is you could put some kind of a tarp over the top of the bed if you're getting more torrential rain to sort of shed some of that extra rain off the top. But if that's too much of a hassle, then the other option is to just keep adding coir after the rain so that you continue to dry it out a bit after the rain, you know, gets to it.
Yeah, we have this kind of strange situation where because in between these very heavy showers of rain, it's actually quite hot now.
Okay.
And so the top layer of where the plants are is actually drying out.
Oh, interesting.
And
okay.
Yeah, but it's not actually penetrating, you know, it's So we're kind of like, well, what do we do? Do we water the plants because they're looking like they need water? But
Yeah.
further down in the actual grow bag, I could still see there's at least, 30 centimeters of just wet.
Okay.
So, and it's on a
Yeah.
milk crate, so I can actually, so it should be draining through.
Okay.
But yeah, it's just, it's a really difficult thing to know whether we're doing the right thing by, maybe watering the plants a little bit around the top.
Yes,
Um,
you can also look at the behavior of the plants. So if they can wilt for two reasons. One is they're too wet or they're too dry, so you have to start to notice the difference. And so one way is to sort of read up on the plants you have in there and see which ones are most sensitive to getting waterlogged and which ones are most sensitive to being underwater, to get an idea of what to do. And then you might want to just put your finger in the soil around the different plants and water individually if you can.
Yeah.
You got mulching on the soil?
Yes, there is mulch, so that's good.
Mhm.
There's a lot of just we had a whole lot of pumpkin seeds come up through the sub pod, and I just replanted all of them. So
Okay.
hopefully pumpkins are fairly resilient.
Yes, they're a good species to transplant out of the sub pod, and if you have the garden space, get a nice crop of pumpkins.
Yeah, so they're all in grow bag.
Okay, that's good. Then what I'd recommend for the mites is, because they're really taking off, is really try to add more carbon to dry it out. And then if you're throwing your hands up, because I know we're in for another La Nina year, which will probably last, the current models are predicting until the end of February.
Yeah.
Of course, by then they could decide, hey, we'll have 4. But what I'm saying is that your typical climate is you guys get the rain now anyway, and so what would you normally expect in January and December for Sydney? Is it
Yeah, we get lots of, so we get, it's hot, it's humid, although humidity doesn't really pick up until December, January.
yeah.
But because we've had so much rain, the humidity is really ramped up and it's early.
Yeah.
So we also usually have, so the thunderstorms will roll through afternoon. So once that heat's had a chance to build up during the day, often we'll get a thunderstorm. But what we found recently is it's just raining every couple of days. It rains, and it's usually like quite a lot of rain.
Yeah, it's a bit of a challenge with your current conditions now. So the ideal thing would be if you could set up some kind of a cover that was transparent, so the sun could shine through, and because if they're vigorous, then they'll be pulling some of that moisture out as well. But then that's a bit of a garden project. I don't know if you're set up for something like that, but I've done that on my beds. For example, I have Mediterranean herbs up here in Byron Bay, and they hate too much water. So I rigged up some hoops of agricultural pipe with star pickets, and then laid a thicker piece of clear plastic, builder's plastic, on top of that, so it sheds the water but lets the light through.
Yeah, and the red spider mites, will they actually do anything? Like, do they?
It's interesting, because there is one particular kind of a red mite that is apparently a parasitic mite for worms, and so I was reading about that online. It's a bit unclear yet whether they're going to be common in the Sydney area. I have to do a bit more digging to find out if it's more of a North America thing or it affects our area. But one way to control them, if that is a possibility, is to use diatomaceous earth. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's basically a white powder you can buy in gardening stores that basically is abrasive for the exoskeleton of all these small beetles and insects and stuff. So you can kind of dust that on the top of the worm blanket, and then it'll probably knock down the population somewhat. But the only thing about it is that it's works when it's dry, but once it gets wet, then it's not as effective. And with all the rain, the worm blanket is probably staying fairly damp, so it wouldn't work for very long before it would be getting wet. So yeah, it's something I've also read that you can try is people put folded paper, and sometimes if they're red mites, they'll congregate on the paper, and you can then pull them out that way.
Mhm.
So you could experiment with laying some paper on top of the worm blanket and see if they tend to aggregate there, and then it'll be easier to remove the bulk of them.
Okay.
And then you mentioned too that your worms went a little AWOL.
Yeah,
Have they come back?
they're still missing, and that we've done the whole banana trick, and yeah, they really don't seem to be all that interested. And I'm just wondering if it's just because it's all new soil, and hopefully
Peter
they're
will comment on that one.
Yeah, well, so typically what happens is in a new system, it's the time when they can be most fussy about conditions where they're adapting to a new environment. And so you've had the hardship of lots of rain. One of the interesting things is if people use a manure-based garden soil, manure is one of their favorite foods. And so there's lots of cases where the worms, given the choice between food scraps and manure, will move into the garden and feast on the manures that you've put in. And so I know, being in Sydney, you don't have a cow paddock nearby to get manure from, but even surprisingly, some of the manures you can buy in garden stores, if you moistened it a bit, it should still have some microbes present, and you could experiment with buying some of that, moistening it, and putting it into the sub pod as a real lure to bring them back. But generally, you're still getting probably. Is this your kind of first experience with worm composting, or do you have previous experience?
So we've also got another sub pod, which is in one of the raised garden beds that we've got.
Okay.
So and that's a more mature system.
Okay.
And we've had that one going for about 6 months, and that's just
good.
packed full of worms.
That's great. That's
so
really great to hear. So that being the case, if necessary, you can move some of the worms from that system,
yeah,
and reestablish in this one, because what will happen is the worms, once they're added to a new system, are starting to culture the bedding with microbes and creating habitat. And a lot of the food breakdown is actually happening from the microbes in the bedding as much as going through the worms. So by putting a lot of worms in there and having them excrete microbes onto the bedding, you'll actually start building up a really good sort of digestive system, so to speak, within the whole bedding of the sub pod, and that'll give you resilience. So the two things to keep in mind is more volume in the new system will help. So it'll swing less between extremes by having a greater volume of bedding. And so it could be as simple as just adding a bit more coir after the rain, and then moving some of the worms over from your other system, and then paying attention to seeing how that's doing. But I suspect the mites will also diminish if the worms are getting through the food faster, because there'll be less for them to be attracted to.
Yeah. I think
And look, I know when I've set up new systems and the worms go AWOL, I just have to be a little patient and just keep adding small amounts of food until they realize that's where the new home source of food is. And they do come back. It's just, all those other reasons that Peter talked about. They're out exploring, or they've found something else that they're interested in snacking on, or,
Yeah, I was wondering if they didn't like the mites as well. So
Yeah, it's
maybe.
possible. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
possible. So So let us know how you go with
Yeah.
the paper, and see, and I'll look a little bit more online to see if there's other ways to lure them onto surfaces to make them easier to remove.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. It sounds like we have to have a little bit of experimentation.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's we're building up a body of knowledge among all the subpod users worldwide, and so hopefully this will be a great resource eventually, where we'll have great troubleshooting experience for all conditions that people are coming across.
Okay. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. For
Any
that.
other questions, anyone? I've sort of gone through everything that we had on Grow Hub. So if you've got any other questions here, please feel free to ask them. And then if not, then we will wind up until next fortnight.
Nothing from me.
Kate, did you have anything else?
No, nothing at the moment. Just this. Yeah. The only other thing is we've got 3 subpods. The one that's out
Okay.
the one that's out the back.
Mhm.
It's also not a mature system. So I've got one that's been about 6 months old, and the other 2 are the most recent ones.
Mhm.
And the one that's at the back of the house has been suffering from a little bit of the moisture problem as well.
Okay. Yeah.
And that one has been attracting ants, and lots of, like, I've actually been removing like a ball of ant eggs and just chucking it into the
Probably
rest
looking
of the
for a
garden.
dry place to set up home.
Yeah, exactly. So this will happen. Normally ants don't like wet conditions, but what's happening now with your weather
Yeah,
is that it's a relatively dry place for them compared to everywhere else.
yeah,
And so one of my favorite ant remedies is basically a saucer that you put on top of the worm blanket that's a
Right.
50-50 mix of sugar and boric acid.
oh, okay.
And they'll be attracted to the sugar, but they'll get the boric acid, and that'll knock them down. It's more of a nuisance than anything. I've had them.
Yeah,
I don't know if this happens to you, but they'll tend to lay their little eggs at the lip of the top of the subpod, and you sweep them off, and eventually they don't like it. But you can try the sugar borax approach, boric
Okay.
acid approach,
Yeah.
and that works against a lot of insects as well.
With good little mites as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the mites. You could try it with the mites as well. I haven't read that people have tried it with mites, but you could experiment there again.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm thinking it's again, as you said, just because it's been so wet, so they're just coming into the subpod and
Nice cozy home.
hanging out in there.
Yes. Yeah.
Good food source.
Yeah, it's
Well,
funny
it's
because they're all
sheltered.
so different. Like all the 3 subpods are so different. Like the oldest one is fine; it's got stuff
Yeah.
growing at it. But the other 2 new ones, which are in totally different places, have these little microclimates that they're.
Yeah.
It's true.
Micro.
It's true.
Micro.
You're
Yeah.
definitely kind of revealing a basic principle of the systems becoming more resilient as they get more mature.
Mm,
And then we've got Linda asking about roly-polies, which is slaters in Australia.
yes.
Yeah, they call them. Yeah. So they if there's just a few of them, they're harmless. They actually are doing their job of breaking down the food. But if you're getting a lot of them, then you can try that same boric. I think in America you can still buy borax and mix that 50-50 with sugar, and that'll work against them as well. But I would suspect the numbers would drop wintertime. I'd be surprised if there would be many. What are you finding at this point, Linda?
Well, I've been removing 3 or 4 slugs every time I go to feed. They're
Yeah.
usually sitting on top of the core.
Yeah.
And then I lift up the core, and then there's usually, 5 to 10 roly-polies around. If
Okay.
I'm taking them inside,
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
I
Fair
don't
enough.
want the population to explode
Yeah.
given different
That's
circumstances.
I completely appreciate the concern there. So I would try the boric acid sugar to knock them down before you move it indoors. Yep, good idea. Yeah.
Okay. Right.
All right. Well, thanks for all the questions, and keep us posted on how the remedies go, and if more things come up, we'll take it from there.
Yeah, put them into the chats or ask Peter directly, or in the Dr. Compost event. I'll be posting next fortnight's event once we've set this one up with the replay. So yeah, thanks everyone. So great to see you here, Linda, Wendy, and Kate. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And
Thanks for that.
yeah, happy composting.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.